The impossible task. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Bletchley Park as Margaret Ashford stared at the mountain of encrypted German transmissions piling up on her desk. It was October 1943, and the Allies were drowning in intercepted messages they couldn't decode fast enough. The Enigma machine had already been partially cracked, but the sheer volume of daily communications, over 15,000 messages, meant that even their best efforts only scratched the surface. Margaret pushed her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose and rubbed her tired eyes. She'd been working 18-hour shifts for 3 weeks straight, and the breakthrough everyone hoped for seemed as distant as ever. Around her, dozens of other codebreakers hunched over their stations, mechanical calculators clicking rhythmically in the background like a swarm of metallic insects. "Another batch from Naval Section," announced Peter Thornton, dropping a thick folder onto her already overflowing workspace. The young Cambridge mathematician looked as exhausted as she felt, his usually neat hair standing at odd angles. "They're prioritizing U-boat positions in the North Atlantic. Command needs these decoded within 6 hours." Margaret wanted to laugh at the impossibility of it all. 6 hours? With their current methods, it would take 6 days. The German forces had recently updated their encryption protocols, adding an extra layer of complexity that turned each message into a mathematical nightmare. Every decoded transmission required painstaking analysis, cross-referencing previous intercepts, and testing thousands of potential rotor positions on the bomb machines, the electromechanical devices designed to crack Enigma settings. She picked up one of the encrypted messages, the seemingly random string of letters mocking her with their gibberish. Somewhere in this chaos was information that could save hundreds of Allied lives: convoy routes to protect, submarine positions to avoid, attack plans to anticipate. But finding it felt like searching for a specific grain of sand on an endless beach. "We're losing the war one message at a time," Margaret muttered, more to herself than to Peter. He paused at the doorway, turning back with a sympathetic expression. "Commander Travis wants to see you at 4 o'clock. Something about resource allocation." His tone suggested it wasn't good news. Margaret glanced at the clock. She had 2 hours. 2 hours to make sense of these impossible codes before she'd likely be told her section was being reassigned or reduced. The pressure from military command was relentless. They didn't understand the complexity of what the codebreakers faced. They only saw results, or the lack thereof. As Peter disappeared down the corridor, Margaret returned her attention to the encrypted message in her hand. There had to be a pattern, a shortcut, something everyone was missing. The Germans were efficient, sometimes too efficient. Their operators made mistakes, used predictable phrases, followed habits. The problem was identifying those patterns fast enough to matter. She began laying out several messages side by side, looking for anything unusual. The clock ticked loudly in the sudden quiet of the room. Around her, colleagues had stepped out for a much-needed tea break, leaving her alone with the whisper of rain and the weight of thousands of undecoded secrets. Margaret didn't know it yet, but in the next few hours, her frustration would transform into an insight so radical, so seemingly insane, that it would change the course of the war. The impossible task. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Bletchley Park as Margaret Ashford stared at the mountain of encrypted German transmissions piling up on her desk. It was October 1943, and the Allies were drowning in intercepted messages they couldn't decode fast enough. The Enigma machine had already been partially cracked, but the sheer volume of daily communications, over 15,000 messages, meant that even their best efforts only scratched the surface. Margaret pushed her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose and rubbed her tired eyes. She'd been working 18-hour shifts for 3 weeks straight, and the breakthrough everyone hoped for seemed as distant as ever. Around her, dozens of other codebreakers hunched over their stations, mechanical calculators clicking rhythmically in the background like a swarm of metallic insects. "Another batch from Naval Section," announced Peter Thornton, dropping a thick folder onto her already overflowing workspace. The young Cambridge mathematician looked as exhausted as she felt, his usually neat hair standing at odd angles. "They're prioritizing U-boat positions in the North Atlantic. Command needs these decoded within 6 hours. Margaret wanted to laugh at the impossibility of it all. 6 hours? With their current methods, it would take 6 days. The German forces had recently updated their encryption protocols, adding an extra layer of complexity that turned each message into a mathematical nightmare. Every decoded transmission required painstaking analysis, cross-referencing previous intercepts, and testing thousands of potential rotor positions on the bomb machines, the electromechanical devices designed to crack Enigma settings. She picked up one of the encrypted messages, the seemingly random string of letters mocking her with their gibberish. Somewhere in this chaos was information that could save hundreds of Allied lives, convoy routes to protect, submarine positions to avoid, attack plans to anticipate. But finding it felt like searching for a specific grain of sand on an endless beach. "We're losing the war one message at a time," Margaret muttered, more to herself than to Peter. He paused at the doorway, turning back with a sympathetic expression. "Commander Travis wants to see you at 4 o'clock. Something about resource allocation." His tone suggested it wasn't good news. Margaret glanced at the clock. She had 2 hours. 2 hours to make sense of these impossible codes before she'd likely be told her section was being reassigned or reduced. The pressure from military command was relentless. They didn't understand the complexity of what the codebreakers faced. They only saw results, or the lack thereof. As Peter disappeared down the corridor, Margaret returned her attention to the encrypted message in her hand. There had to be a pattern, a shortcut, something everyone was missing. The Germans were efficient, sometimes too efficient. Their operators made mistakes, used predictable phrases, followed habits. The problem was identifying those patterns fast enough to matter. She began laying out several messages side by side, looking for anything unusual. The clock ticked loudly in the sudden quiet of the room. Around her, colleagues had stepped out for a much-needed tea break, leaving her alone with the whisper of rain and the weight of thousands of undecoded secrets. Margaret didn't know it yet, but in the next few hours, her frustration would transform into an insight so radical, so seemingly insane, that it would change the course of the war. Building the framework. Margaret didn't sleep that night. While the rest of Bletchley Park descended into its usual nocturnal quiet, she remained at her desk, surrounded by hundreds of intercepted messages, building what would become her revolutionary framework. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of treating each message as a unique cryptographic puzzle, identify the structural patterns that German military discipline demanded. By 3 in the morning, she had identified 7 distinct message types, each with its own predictable opening sequence. U-boat position reports began with time stamps and coordinates. Luftwaffe weather observations followed meteorological reporting standards. Supply requisitions opened with standardized inventory codes. The Germans, for all their encryption sophistication, were creatures of habit and procedure. "You're still here." Peter's voice startled her as dawn began breaking through the windows. He carried 2 cups of strong tea and looked as though he hadn't slept much either. "I couldn't stop thinking about your theory. I've been running calculations." He spread out several sheets of paper covered in mathematical notations. "If we're correct about the structural patterns, and if we can pre-configure the bomb machines to search only for combinations that produce those expected opening sequences, we could reduce processing time by a factor of 15. Maybe more." Margaret felt a surge of excitement, mixed with trepidation. The number was almost too good to believe. 15 times faster? That would mean processing capacity of over 700 messages per day, per machine. With our current complement of bombs, we could theoretically handle 10,000 messages daily. Peter's hand shook slightly as he sipped his tea. "Margaret, if this works, it changes everything." The practical challenges were enormous. However, they would need to reprogram the bomb machines, train operators on the new methodology, and most critically, convince Commander Travis and the other senior staff that this wasn't a waste of precious time and resources. The military mind didn't respond well to theoretical breakthroughs. They wanted proven results. "We need a demonstration," Margaret decided. "A controlled test with yesterday's intercepts. We already know which ones are traditional methods decoded. If we can show that your shortcut method reaches the same solutions in a fraction of time, we'll have our proof. They spent the next several hours preparing. Margaret selected 20 messages that had been successfully decoded through conventional means, noting the time each had required, ranging from 40 minutes to over 3 hours per message. Peter recalibrated one of the smaller bomb machines in a rarely used section of the facility, implementing Margaret's structural pattern recognition protocol. By noon, they were ready. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she fed the first encrypted message into the modified machine. Around them, a small group of curious colleagues had gathered, drawn by rumors of something unusual happening. The bomb whirred to life, its rotating drums clicking through possibilities at mechanical speed. In the conventional approach, this message had taken 97 minutes to decode. Margaret watched the clock, each second feeling like an eternity. 4 minutes later, the machine stopped. The decoded message appeared on the output tape, perfect and complete. The watching codebreakers erupted in excited chatter. Margaret and Peter exchanged stunned glances. It had worked, better than they'd dared hope. "Do another one," someone called out. They ran 5 more tests. The results were consistent. Messages that previously required an hour or more were being decoded in 3 to 7 minutes. The shortcut wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. Word spread through Bletchley Park like wildfire. The skeptics and the stakes. Commander Travis arrived within the hour, accompanied by several senior cryptanalysts and a stern-looking colonel from military intelligence. The atmosphere in the cramped machine room grew tense as the officials examined Margaret's work with critical eyes. "It's statistical noise," declared Dr. Harold Pemberton, one of the senior cryptanalysts. A Cambridge don with 20 years of mathematical research behind him, Pemberton had initially dismissed Margaret's appointment to Bletchley Park, suggesting women lacked the analytical rigor for serious cryptographic work. "You've gotten lucky with a handful of messages. Scale this up to hundreds of intercepts, and your patterns will disintegrate." Margaret kept her voice steady despite the condescension dripping from his words. "The patterns aren't statistical accidents, Dr. Pemberton. They're the direct result of German military communication protocols. Protocol adherence is strongest precisely when operating under stress, which describes virtually every German military transmission we intercept." "Show me," Travis interrupted, his gruff voice cutting through the brewing argument. "I don't care about theories. Decode something we haven't cracked yet. Something fresh." An assistant brought in a bundle of that morning's intercepts, messages that hadn't yet been assigned to any code-breaking team. Travis selected one at random and handed it to Margaret. "This came from a German destroyer in the Mediterranean. Priority marking suggests it's important. Decode it. Now." The room fell silent. Margaret's mouth went dry. This wasn't a controlled test with messages she'd studied. This was the real thing, with her entire methodology on trial. She glanced at Peter, who gave her an encouraging nod. She fed the message into the modified bomb machine, her fingers moving through the setup procedure she and Peter had refined. Based on the message's length and origin, she selected what appeared to be a naval tactical report pattern, standardized opening with ship identification, position, and status markers. The machine began its mechanical dance. 3 minutes passed. 4. Margaret could feel Pemberton's smug satisfaction radiating across the room. 5 minutes. Had she been wrong? Had they just gotten lucky with the earlier tests? At 6 minutes and 43 seconds, the bomb stopped. Margaret pulled the decoded tape with shaking hands and began reading. Destroyer Brandt reporting heavy damage from air attack. Taking water in forward compartments. Requesting immediate assistance. Current position. She read out the coordinates and the rest of the message. Travis immediately grabbed the telephone on the wall. "Give me naval operations. We have a German destroyer dead in the water south of Crete. Scramble whatever assets we have in the area." He hung up and turned back to Margaret. How long would this have taken using conventional methods? Best case scenario, assuming we'd prioritized it? Probably 2 to 3 hours, Peter answered. More likely 4 to 6 hours, given current workload, by which time the destroyer would have been rescued or scuttled, and the opportunity lost. Travis looked at Margaret with new respect. How quickly can you train others in this method? And how many bombs can we convert? Dr. Pemberton sputtered. Commander, surely we need more rigorous testing. One successful decode proves nothing. It proves, Travis interrupted coldly, that Miss Ashford accomplished in 7 minutes what your entire section couldn't do in 7 hours. We're losing this war in the Atlantic because we can't process intelligence fast enough. If this method works even half as well as it appears to, we implement it immediately. Over the next 48 hours, Margaret barely left Bletchley Park. She and Peter trained teams of operators in the new methodology, converting bomb machines one by one to the pattern recognition protocols. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Each successful decode validated her approach, building confidence across the facility. The first breakthrough. Within a week, Margaret's methodology had been implemented across 12 bomb machines, and the results exceeded even her optimistic projections. The code-breaking section that had been processing 47 messages per day was now handling over 400. The backlog of undecoded intercepts, which had been growing exponentially, began to shrink. The real test came on November 15th, when the modified section intercepted and decoded a series of U-boat communications that revealed a coordinated Wolfpack attack being organized against Allied convoy HX-265, carrying critical supplies from New York to Liverpool. The messages were decoded in rapid succession. 17 intercepts processed in less than 3 hours, providing not just the attack location, but timing, participating submarines, and tactical approaches. Margaret stood in the operations room as naval commanders redirected escort destroyers and maritime patrol aircraft based on her decoded intelligence. For the first time since beginning this work, she could see the direct connection between the abstract mathematics of cryptanalysis and the concrete reality of ships, sailors, and lives at stake. Convoy HX-265 has altered course, announced a naval officer, marking the change on the massive wall map. Destroyer escorts moving to intercept the Wolfpack's projected position. The next several hours were agonizing. Radio silence from the convoy meant they wouldn't know the outcome until the ships were safely past the danger zone. Margaret tried to return to work, but found herself unable to concentrate. What if she'd made an error? What if the decoded messages had led the convoy into worse danger? Peter found her at midnight, staring at cold tea in the canteen. You should go home. Get some rest. What if I was wrong? What if? Margaret, he sat down across from her. You've decoded over 300 messages in the past week using this method. Every single one has been verified as accurate. You need to trust your work. The confirmation came at dawn. Convoy HX-265 had not only evaded the Wolfpack, but had coordinated with their escorts to sink 2 U-boats and damage a third. 37 merchant vessels carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food supplies had reached Liverpool intact. Thousands of tons of material that would have rested at the bottom of the Atlantic were instead being unloaded at British docks. Commander Travis called Margaret to his office. She expected congratulations, perhaps even a commendation. Instead, she found him pacing anxiously, a telegram clutched in his hand. Admiralty has taken notice of your work, he said without preamble. They want to expand implementation immediately. All bomb machines converted to your methodology within 10 days. They're also allocating resources for 20 additional machines to be built specifically for pattern recognition decoding. Margaret felt a flutter of pride, but Travis's expression remained grim. What's wrong, sir? The Germans aren't stupid, Miss Ashford. Eventually, they'll notice that we're interdicting their operations with suspicious frequency. When that happens, they'll change everything, new protocols, new encryption methods, possibly even replacement of the entire Enigma system. Your shortcut works because they're following predictable patterns. Make them paranoid enough, and those patterns disappear. The implications settled over Margaret like a cold blanket. Her breakthrough had given them an advantage, but it was an advantage with an expiration date. They were racing against the German military's ability to recognize and adapt to the security breach. How long do we have? She asked quietly. Unknown. Could be months. Could be weeks. Intelligence suggests the Germans already suspect their codes are compromised. They just haven't determined how badly. Travis met her eyes. We need to extract maximum value from your method while we still can. That means decoding everything as fast as possible before the window closes. Margaret nodded slowly. Then we'd better get back to work. The acceleration. The transformation of Bletchley Park over the following weeks was extraordinary. Margaret's methodology spread through every section, with Codebreakers adapting her pattern recognition principles to different types of German communications. Luftwaffe intercepts, Wehrmacht field reports, even SS administrative messages. Each had their own structural quirks that could be exploited once you knew what to look for. The facility operated around the clock now, with 3 full shifts of workers cycling through 8-hour periods. Margaret found herself in the peculiar position of having become essential to operations she'd barely understood months earlier. Senior military officials who had previously ignored her now sought her input on everything from resource allocation to strategic priorities. "We're processing 7,800 messages per day," Peter told her one morning in early December, sliding a statistical summary across her desk. "That's a 20-fold increase from October. The modified bombs are running at 93% efficiency." Margaret studied the numbers with mixed feelings. The success was undeniable, but so was the pressure. Every day brought new demands, new challenges, new expectations. The German military machine generated an endless stream of communications, and staying ahead of it felt like trying to bail out the ocean with a teacup. More concerning were the subtle changes she'd begun noticing in recent intercepts. German operators were becoming more careful, less predictable. Messages that once followed rigid protocols now showed variations, deliberate deviations that suggested someone on the German side was questioning their communication security. "They're adapting," she told Commander Travis during their weekly briefing. "Look at these U-boat transmissions from the past 3 days. The opening sequences are less standardized. They're introducing random variations to mask the structural patterns." Travis examined the messages with a furrowed brow. "Are they onto us?" "Not necessarily. This could be routine security evolution, but it's definitely making our job harder." Margaret pulled out another set of intercepts. "These Luftwaffe weather reports have completely changed format as of yesterday. New protocol, different structure. It took us 6 hours to identify the new pattern and adjust our approach." 6 hours is still better than the days it would have taken before your method, Travis pointed out. "True, but the trend is worrying. If they implement systematic protocol changes across all their forces, we'll be back to square one. Maybe worse, because now they're actively thinking about communication security in ways they weren't before." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock. A young woman from the intercept station burst in without ceremony. "Commanders, we're picking up enormous signal traffic from German Naval Command. Hundreds of messages in the past hour alone. Something big is happening." Margaret and Travis rushed to the operations room, where radio operators were frantically transcribing incoming transmissions. The volume was unprecedented, messages flooding in faster than they could be logged, let alone decoded. "Get these to the bombs immediately," Travis barked. "Priority classification on everything from Naval Command. Move." Margaret grabbed a handful of intercepts and sprinted to the machine room. The next several hours became a blur of frantic activity. Messages were fed into the modified bombs as fast as operators could load them. Decoded outputs spilled across tables as analysts scrambled to piece together what was happening. Gradually, a picture emerged. The German Navy was organizing a major operation in the North Atlantic. Multiple submarine groups coordinating with surface raiders to attack convoy routes simultaneously. It was ambitious, sophisticated, and potentially devastating if successful. "How long until they execute?" Travis demanded. Margaret scanned through the decoded messages, her trained eye picking out time references and operational scheduling. 72 hours. Maybe less. They're moving assets into position now. The race against time. The next 3 days tested Margaret's methodology like never before. Every hour brought dozens of new German transmissions as their forces coordinated the complex operation. The modified bombs ran continuously, operators working in exhausting shifts to keep pace with the flood of intelligence. Margaret herself hardly slept, surviving on strong tea and nervous energy. The operations room had become her world, a windowless chamber filled with maps, decoded messages, and the constant murmur of military personnel coordinating Allied responses to the developing German threat. "We've identified 7 U-boat groups," she briefed the assembled naval commanders, pointing to marked positions on the Atlantic chart. 3 heavy surface raiders here, and here. They're planning coordinated attacks on 3 separate convoys over a 48-hour period, starting December 18th at 0400 hours. Admiral Richardson, a gray-haired veteran who'd been fighting U-boats since 1939, studied the map intently. "You're certain of these positions? We're talking about redeploying significant assets based on your intelligence." "As certain as cryptanalysis allows, sir. We've decoded over 200 messages related to this operation. The pattern is consistent and detailed." Richardson nodded slowly. "Then we'll set a trap. Convoy routes will continue as planned, but we'll have submarines of our own waiting at these intercept points. Additional destroyer escorts will converge from here and here. When the Germans surface to attack, they'll find themselves facing considerably more resistance than expected." The plan was audacious and risky. If Margaret's decoded intelligence was wrong, they'd waste crucial resources and leave actual convoys vulnerable. But if she was right, they had a chance to inflict serious damage on Germany's submarine fleet. December 18th arrived with agonizing slowness. Margaret remained in the operations room as reports began filtering in. The first U-boat group had been detected exactly where her decoded messages indicated, approaching Convoy SC 147. Allied submarines were moving into position. Surface escorts were ready. "Contact," announced a signals officer. "HMS Trojan has torpedoed you 573. Confirmed kill." Over the next 6 hours, the carefully laid trap snapped shut. Of the 7 U-boat groups Margaret had identified, 5 were engaged by Allied forces. 3 submarines were sunk, 4 more damaged and forced to withdraw. The German surface raiders, discovering that surprise had been lost, retreated without engaging. All 3 targeted convoys reached their destinations intact. The victory was significant, but Margaret felt more relief than triumph. Every decoded message, every identified position had been a calculation with lives hanging in the balance. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. "Remarkable work, Miss Ashford," Admiral Richardson told her afterward, his weathered face showing genuine respect. "You and your team may have just changed the momentum of the Atlantic War." But Margaret's attention was already on the newest intercepts, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The messages were different: heavily modified protocols, irregular formatting, deliberate randomization of what had been predictable patterns. The Germans had finally realized their communications were compromised at a fundamental level. "Commander Travis," she called urgently, "we have a problem. The evolution." The German response to their intelligence breach was swift and comprehensive. Within days of the failed December operation, their military communications underwent systematic transformation. New Enigma rotor configurations were distributed. Standardized protocols were abandoned in favor of deliberately irregular message structures. The elegant shortcuts that had made Margaret's methodology so effective began to crumble. "We're back to processing maybe 2,000 messages per day," Peter reported grimly in early January 1944. "Better than before your breakthrough, but nowhere near our peak capacity. The patterns we relied on are disappearing." Margaret sat surrounded by dozens of new intercepts, each one a fresh puzzle. The Germans hadn't just changed their methods. They'd learned to think like cryptanalysts, deliberately introducing noise and variation to mask legitimate information. Her revolutionary shortcut was becoming obsolete in real time. "So we adapt again," she said firmly. "They're still using Enigma machines. The fundamental mathematics haven't changed. We need to find new patterns new shortcuts in whatever system they're implementing now. But privately, she wondered if they were approaching the limits of what was possible. Each successive German security improvement made the cryptographic challenge exponentially harder. Eventually, they might reach a point where decoding became mathematically infeasible, or at least too slow to provide actionable intelligence. The winter of 1944 became a war of attrition between codebreakers and encryption. Margaret's team would identify a new exploitable pattern. The Germans would recognize the breach and change their procedures. Each cycle of innovation and counter-innovation lasted shorter than the last. The dance was exhausting and relentless. Yet paradoxically, this very struggle pushed Margaret toward deeper insights. In analyzing how the Germans modified their protocols, she began understanding not just individual encryption methods, but the underlying principles of secure communication itself. She started developing theoretical frameworks for pattern recognition that could adapt dynamically to changing encryption environments. "You're not just breaking codes anymore," Peter observed one evening as they reviewed her latest theoretical work. "You're creating a new field of study. Adaptive cryptanalysis. Pattern recognition theory. This is going to matter long after this war ends." Margaret looked up from her calculations, surprised. She'd been so focused on the immediate challenges that she hadn't considered the broader implications. But Peter was right. The methodologies they were developing had applications far beyond military intelligence. In a world where information increasingly drove strategic advantage, the ability to extract meaning from encrypted communications would only grow more important. "Assuming we survive this war," she said quietly. "We will, partly because of work like yours." By spring of 1944, Allied intelligence had processed over 1.5 million German messages using variations of Margaret's methodology. The tally included decoded warnings that prevented dozens of convoy attacks, identified Wehrmacht troop movements before major operations, and provided insights into German industrial capacity and resource constraints. While the dramatic processing speeds of November and December couldn't be sustained, the cumulative intelligence advantage remained enormous. Commander Travis called Margaret to his office on a bright morning in April. "There's a car waiting for you outside. You're wanted in London. Very senior people want to meet the woman who changed how we fight this war." Margaret felt a flash of anxiety. "Sir, my work here." "Your work here continues. This is just recognition that's long overdue." Travis actually smiled, a rare expression on his stern face. "Take the compliment, Miss Ashford. You've earned it." The meeting in London was surreal. Brass from multiple services, intelligence officials, even a brief appearance by the Prime Minister himself. Margaret felt distinctly out of place among the uniforms and formal dress, still wearing her practical working clothes for Bletchley Park. But what struck her most was the realization that her insane shortcut, the pattern recognition methodology born from frustration and desperation, had become standard practice across Allied cryptanalysis. Other codebreakers were adapting and extending her principles to Japanese codes, Italian communications, even French resistance coordination. The ripple effects extended far beyond her original U-boat intercepts. Returning to Bletchley Park that evening, Margaret found Peter waiting with news. Fresh intercepts from a German diplomatic channel. "New encryption system we haven't seen before. Complex, sophisticated, and absolutely brimming with structural patterns once you know where to look." Margaret felt familiar excitement stirring. "Show me." As they bent over the new challenge, the war continuing its vast machinery around them, Margaret realized that this was her contribution, not just decoded messages or saved ships, but a fundamental shift in how humans thought about hidden information. Every code was a pattern. Every pattern could be recognized. Every recognition was a step toward understanding. The shortcut that had seemed insane months ago now seemed inevitable, obvious in hindsight, as the best breakthroughs often were. And while the specific tactics would continue evolving, the underlying principle remained constant. Human communication, even when encrypted, carried inherent structure. Find that structure, exploit it intelligently, and seemingly unbreakable codes became merely difficult. Outside the windows of Bletchley Park, Spring rain began to fall. Inside, the bombs continued their mechanical rhythm, processing thousands of messages. And somewhere in the vast flow of intercepted data, new patterns waited to be discovered by anyone patient and clever enough to see them. The war would eventually end. The specific codes would become historical footnotes. But the methodology, the insane shortcut that let a handful of codebreakers process 10,000 messages a day, would endure, laying groundwork for future generations who would face their own cryptographic challenges in an increasingly connected world. Margaret returned to work, ready for whatever puzzle came next.